Welcome to the ISF podcast from the Information Security Forum, featuring timely conversations, practical insights, and resources for global cybersecurity professionals. I'm your host, Tavia Gilbert. Our theme this season is disruption. And today, ISF CEO Steve Durbin and I discuss digital totalitarianism, a conversation based on the ISF's reporting for the Astana Club, an international discussion platform that gathers prominent political figures, diplomats, and experts from the world's top analytical centers. Steve is a regular contributor. Before we get into the content of the paper on digital totalitarianism, Steve, could you tell us a little bit more about ISF's history with the Astana Club and how your relationship with them developed?
You've given a pretty good summary of what the Astana Club is all about. Its focus is on Eurasia, so it is a slightly different focus perhaps than you would find with World Economic Forum, which takes a broader perspective. And what that allows us to do, of course, is to delve much more deeply into issues that would affect that geographic region. And over the years that I've been involved with it, I think it's probably going to a fifth year now, something like that I've been involved, we've covered off a whole range of different topic areas. But some of the things that have been consistent through that are, yes, political issues, the traditional Cold War type issues. But we started to see as well this need for an emerging discussion in the region around cyber threat. And I do remember that, as I say, going back about 4 or 5 years, right at the very beginning of getting involved, where it was all totally fresh and new. And people, I think, in the club were surprised by the level of impact that cyber or security would be having, just outside of technology, because of course the whole focus is around, regional development and recovery and so on. And so over that sort of 3 to 4 year period, it's been interesting to watch the way that cyber has taken on much more of a mainstream role in its own right. And as you say, we're going to talk here about digital totalitarianism. And in the next podcast that we do after this, of course, we're going to go on to talk about a global cyber crisis as well. And, those sorts of components cannot be viewed in isolation. And so one of the great things about the Astana Club and my involvement with that is that I get to see how it fits into what I would say is a much more traditional political worldview of the way in which regions are evolving and developing. And it is a sort of a melting pot of politicians and diplomats and scientists and experts all coming together to look at some of these things, which makes for a very interesting, very vibrant environment for discussion.
Let's go deeper into the conversation today. The pandemic demonstrated convincingly that technologies designed to facilitate communication are actively used to massively and uncontrollably collect personal information from the population. We talked in our last episode about the impact of the pandemic on communication systems. So businesses around the globe have come to absolutely rely on these technologies in order to function in the most basic ways. But the technologies don't have any regard for the privacy of our personal data, and that actually has potentially terrifying repercussions. Can you give us an example of some of those technologies and explain some of the implications of their disregard for privacy?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, as you point out, Tavia, it is frightening. And we're talking, I suppose, about both apps, Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp being among the most popular, as well as devices and their operating systems. So, 15% of smartphone users worldwide use iPhones with iOS. And there are devices, Windows phones and other Android phones, which run on the Android operating system. And as a result of our use of those technologies alone, so just look at those, there's a colossal concentration of personal data that is then being put into the hands of global players in the information technology market. And that gives them a form of digital control over the lives of citizens. And there is no boundary, I suppose, is the way of looking at it, because the data travels across multiple jurisdictions of nation states all around the world. It's one of the challenges that law enforcement has, for instance, in trying to track down cyber criminals, because, of course, there is no boundary as such within which they operate. And one of the things that comes out in some of the findings in the Astana paper that I co-authored was that this year, 2021, In particular, the countries in Eurasia are going to face a very difficult choice of format and model for their future digital transformation, from complete market freedom in the digital sphere to a very much more rigid and unambiguous definition of the boundaries of digital sovereignty. So taking that environment that is an absolute free-for-all and saying, how are we now going to navigate a way through that? How are we going to try to put down some form of control, some form of guideline, some lanes that we all know how to drive within? And that's hugely challenging for, evolving, emerging countries. And that's one of the big challenges that's highlighted for this year there. And as I say, it is really being driven by the individual, by individual technologies. And I think that very often when we think about the way in which perhaps the tech world is developing, we think very much about the way in which the large players, and I mentioned, Facebook and so on, the way in which they're driving it forward. But actually, the individual is doing a lot of that driving too, in the way that they use the technology. The challenge, certainly for governments, for legislators, is how do you then manage that? It's a challenge for businesses as well, of course. But how do you actually manage that from an overall country perspective? And, we're starting to see different countries adopt different approaches. Some are closing down things, so you have to store data within your jurisdiction. Others are being a bit more liberal about it and allowing things to be a bit more free flow. So it's a really interesting phenomenon to watch. And I think one that certainly will remain current for some years to come, because I don't think we're close to getting it right.
Obviously, going digital has been the trend for years, so this didn't come out of nowhere, but it seems like the pandemic was really a turning point or a starting point for actual recognition of the data economy and data society. Do you think that's true? Was the pandemic a catalyst that flipped the light switch and made people much more aware than ever before of the reality of our data universe?
I think that the pandemic did have a role to play. I think that it is at the center of what's become a new format of economic structure and business models, particularly in that sort of digitized personality that we're beginning to talk about now. And personal data is becoming very much more of a major economic category, the oil of the 21st century, if you like, and you hear that term bandied about quite regularly now. And in the new digital society, the main task really is to establish control over information by analogy with managing the flows of world finance and natural resources. So it's how do you actually, I'm hesitating to use the word control again, but how do you sort of marshal some of those things? How do you manage them? I think is probably the best way of looking at it. And, the largest players in the digital information market, and these are people like Facebook, they are people like Apple, Google, Amazon. And then if we go over into China, of course, you've got Tencent, you've got Alibaba, you've got TikTok. They're all accumulating colossal streams of metadata on their platforms, simultaneously exerting a large-scale impact on social, cultural, and even political processes in societies around the world. A five-fold increase in the volume of data generated by government services, companies, and citizens by 2025, which is really what we're talking about, will allow the owners of those sorts of information, banks of data, to have an absolutely unprecedented level of access to a person's private life. And it isn't just a historical view, because yes, the data refers to the history, but the ability of the algorithms and increasingly artificial intelligence is to then use that to predict the future. And of course, this is something that Amazon, Google, Facebook have been doing for quite some while. So the role of the past is hugely important in this environment in terms of predicting the future. And, it's these sort of highly connected ecosystems of digital devices that will enable the harvest, repurpose, and indeed sale of sensitive behavioral data about individuals, unfortunately, without their consent in a lot of cases. And there's also a growing number of sectors that we're going to see have an increased dependency on behavioral analytics too, that will again come from this source of data. And that includes finance, it includes healthcare, it includes education.
I know that people are writing more and more and sounding a warning cry about the gravity of our personal data being so available and so out of our control. Do you think that governments or business leaders or historians or whoever should be in charge of sounding that cry, are they letting citizens know about this reality enough? Are citizens informed and becoming aware quickly enough of what they really are sacrificing every time they check Facebook, every time they look at a TikTok video? Or are we still, largely blind or unaware of the impact of our data being available so widely?
I think what we're doing is we're trying to find our way as a society in this particular area. So you may remember, Mark Zuckerberg talking about privacy being an outmoded concept for the 21st century because we've already given that up. Because every time we do something, it's picked up by an algorithm and adapted, or it's used to go into a data bank, or it's used in some other kind of way. And we're doing that willingly. And so we are, I think, at a time in history where we are trying to figure it out. What do we really care about? And we're seeing polarization. We're seeing people who are really quite blasé about how that information potentially is used. And then we're seeing the opposite end of the spectrum where people are hugely concerned about it. And so in the middle, you've got governments and legislators. And then if you throw cybercrime on top of that and, all of the other things that are going on, and the fact that, cyber has a value in terms of their economies. So we are finding our way. And the role of government in all of that is really to try to understand a future direction and convey that and educate people down that road. But we have this battle, if you like, that's going on at the moment between government and private sector in that space. And that's really interesting to watch because on the one hand, the technology providers that I've mentioned have been gathering all of this data. They would claim it's being freely given. And so what's the problem? On the other hand, you have government whose role it is to try to legislate, regulate in that space too. And yet the two sides are, publicly anyway, somewhat miles apart. So how we move forward from that position is very interesting. And then if you look at what government is doing anyway from a surveillance standpoint, then it too is using some of these tools and techniques, to battle cybercrime, terrorism, and all of those sorts of things. And one of the examples that very often pops up now is the effective way that technology is being used to manage the COVID pandemic. Understanding where different people are who perhaps are infected, understanding how the pandemic is spreading, being able potentially to predict that, which of course has all sorts of value in terms of being able to provide the right level of healthcare and so on. And so that for me really encapsulates this really challenging period that we're going through, which is if you didn't have access to that information, you wouldn't be able to do those sorts of things. But are we prepared to pay the price for giving access to that information? And that's the sort of thing that is being debated all around the world. It goes right to the heart of ethics and the way that technology is used. It's particularly relevant when we start talking about artificial intelligence as well, because that will build on some of those findings. So we're actually living at a really interesting period because we've got, these new waves of technology coming through. The data is growing exponentially. We're sharing it second by second, and there's a lot of use that it can be put to. But what then is the role of the individual in all of that? Oh, I don't have an answer for it.
The paper for the Astana Club mentions the global process of human digitization, which is a very loaded phrase, makes me quite uncomfortable, has moved from the stage of creating a digital avatar into filling a digital profile. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. So, for some time now, personal information such as place of birth, residence, marital status, property has been collected. That's nothing new. But now the profile is overgrown with information from credit reporting companies, police databases, video surveillance systems, information about the nature of relationships with relatives, with neighbors, participation in charity, other events. And citizens are no longer required to consent in a lot of instances to the collection of information, which is happening non-stop over Wi-Fi networks, video cameras with face recognition technology, biometric scanners, QR codes, smart TVs, Alexa, your Apple Watch, or whatever you happen to be using. The list goes on and on and on. With the introduction of 5G technologies and the expansion of the range of AI applications, as I've mentioned, any person's profile will be integrated with data from the Internet of Things, records from educational institutions, medical records, and so on, that's all pulled together in one place to give you that total picture at that single point in time of an individual, with algorithms that allow you not just to understand, as I say, what's happened in the past, but also to potentially predict the future.
We've talked about COVID. I'm wondering if this could have implications for something like vaccination programs. I have to admit that these days I can understand why someone would want to know whether the person near them has been vaccinated for COVID-19 or not. What's the implication of that?
Yeah, it's understandable, isn't it? But of course, the line between compulsory and mandatory can get blurred here in a way that we really do need to be mindful of. Splicing a person with digital gadgets can lead to computer algorithms making decisions for the user themselves. And at the same time, the very nature of some of the proposals that are being put forward can easily be replaced by a mandatory one as opposed to anything else. And that, I think, is really where the challenge comes in. So, some of these sort of mechanisms of compulsory medicine, if I put it that way, are already being worked out as part of the fight against the spread of COVID. So I'm thinking about things like China's health code app, European Gateway, Apple, Google's apps, that track coronavirus transmission. That all highlights the potential for digital surveillance for medical purposes going forward. And as a result of that, the IT giants and individual states have ever-increasing access to personal information that allows them to launch large-scale behavioral programming processes. And again, that's the danger. It's where do you draw the line? It may well be useful to go up to a certain point, but who says stop? And that is the piece that we haven't figured out yet.
Right. And I understand that China has created a social rating system for its citizens where they get credit for being so-called good citizens. And I think that demonstrates the potential for this to go terribly wrong.
Yeah, I mean, this is, essentially a social experiment on behavioral programming of more than 1 billion inhabitants of the world's largest country by population. That's unprecedented in scale and nature. The formation of an improved citizen, if you like, who accepts the rules of the game in exchange for comfort and various social benefits, establishes a person's total information transparency in front of corporations that control the flow of information. But we shouldn't just think about this as being, a Chinese issue and something that is restricted to authoritarian governments. If you look at a list of the most surveilled cities in the world, yes, 18 of the top 20 are in China, but number 3 on that list is in fact London. And signs of total digital control are already present in most countries where the internet and social networks are widespread. So it's nothing new. The key issue, and I keep coming back to this, is how do we regulate these technologies to ensure their safety? And traditionally, this has been the responsibility of the state, and we need to see more, I think, from various governments in this regard.
I understand that the COVID-19 pandemic rapidly increased the adoption of digital behavioral monitoring technologies globally. And we also have the introduction of 5G and the emergence of super speeds for data transfer. And all of that gives video analytics a huge boost.
Yeah, it does. The global video surveillance market is projected to increase by $36 billion by 2024. That's an average annual growth of about 12%. So not too shabby at all, particularly if you happen to be making those sorts of cameras. And in Europe and North America alone, camera numbers are projected to grow by 18% annually. That's resulting in something like over 400 million camera installations by 2024.
Wow.
And that's to say nothing of smartphones, which of course also offer really unprecedented opportunities for collecting data about their users and their surrounding social environment. And it's interesting that, according to some statistics I saw provided by Exodus Privacy, almost every Android application contains at least one tracker, which is responsible for advertising, authorization, and analytics. And At the same time, the technical stuffing of the digital platforms used allows data to be transferred to servers and cloud storage services outside state borders,
Hmm.
which raises serious questions about ensuring national information security. And this is some of the discussion that we're now seeing and what's behind some of the restrictions around where data can be stored, which to a certain extent anyway does question the efficacy of cloud computing if you look at it again from a total global perspective. But you can understand why certain states are looking to do that.
Hmm.
And in fact, the ownership of digital technologies guarantees control over those who use these technologies. And that's something that people very often don't realize.
Right.
As a result of all of that, the rapidly emerging global digital space presupposes the integration of states into the system of the new business model of IT giants, and not vice versa. And that's worth just thinking through too. And this is what is really behind some of the toing and froing that we see quite regularly now between very large IT providers and people like the European Commission, who are very active in this space in terms of trying to regulate. But it's going to continue. And we're not at a point where we've reached the end of that, or even indeed some form of truce and collaborative way forward.
So what does this mean going forward? The pace of global digital transformation is not going to slow down. It's, in fact, expected to accelerate exponentially across the entire planet.
Well, yeah, we anticipate that the race for biometric and other personal data is certainly going to intensify the widespread intervention of the world's leading players in the digital industry. Further use and accumulated volume of personal data turns into a powerful tool for this behavioral engineering that I was talking about, the use of algorithms to predict how the population is going to behave. And the process of merging the interests of the tech giants with the interests and needs of states of their main jurisdictions is going to continue. We're not at the end of that.
Right.
That will necessarily need to include solving foreign policy problems, economic and ideological expansion. And, even today, there are active attempts to use popular social networks and instant messages to influence the social, cultural, and political processes in a number of countries around the world. But against this background, the response to the strengthening of national digital sovereignty within state borders will continue to be reinforced. Turkey and other countries are setting the example of trying to introduce legal rules and restrictions for global social networks on their territory. And this speaks to the formation of a new sustainable trend of digital sovereignty, and with regard to Astana, particularly in the Eurasian space. The success of different states' attempts to ensure the nationalization and protection of personal data of their population will directly depend on whether a particular country has the ability to create its own technological solutions and standards in the digital sphere. In fact, access to modern technological developments in the field of big data, AI, 5G, becoming the most important guarantee of survival in the increasingly aggressive space of digital geopolitical competition. And players who lag behind in the digital race will eventually be deprived of the opportunity to fully ensure their own sovereignty, turning into digital colonies of the leaders of the global technological race. And if you think through that, that is potentially a very frightening concept. And that is what is behind the rush, if you like, in what I would term a cyber arms race to really expand this overall digital capability in-house, in-nation, because the stakes are exceptionally high.
That's a lot to consider, and I'm sure it will leave our listeners with as much space for contemplation about our individual futures as much as nation futures. So thanks for sharing. And I don't say that with sarcasm. Good to be prepared, aware. Next week, you and I will discuss another lighthearted topic coming from the Astana Club paper regarding global cyber crisis. Here's a clip from that conversation.
I was thinking about this just the other day. I think we've moved, and this, I would include breaches in this, so not just cyber crime, but also breaches. We've moved to a point, I think, where it's just part of life. And that's a pretty sad thing to say. But I think that when we started talking about some of these things, they were shocking, they were unusual. They aren't anymore. And I think that that's reflected, or has to be reflected, in our response to them. So I'm thinking particularly here about very many organizations that will still press CISOs, to prevent a breach, prevent an attack.
Which is unrealistic.
And yes, of course, it is unrealistic. That is the point. And so there is this shift to, okay, if I can't prevent an attack or I can't prevent a breach, how can I ensure a degree of resilience for my organization? How can I protect what is really important? And that's a fundamental shift.
We'll be back for the full conversation in a week. In the meantime, would you consider writing a short review of the ISF podcast? Reviews are a big support in helping new listeners discover our program, so if you do have a moment, we would be so grateful for your time. Is there a topic or a question that you'd like us to cover in a future episode? Let us know at securityforum.org. And while you're there, we invite you to explore our catalog of past video and podcast episodes, as well as ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like these. Find us on LinkedIn by searching CEO Steve Durbin or Security Forum. Follow our audio feed wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll never miss an episode. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox and Tavia Gilbert. Music by Alexander Filipiak. Associate producer Katie Flood. Mix and master by Brian Barney. Thanks for listening.